Hello, this is Ron Gerber, CEO of Angelbeat, trying to add some perspective on the related topics of EHS, net zero, and ESG. Just to give you a little background on myself, I run Angelbeat. I founded the company. We do many events, webinars, consulting activities around sustainability as well as technology. I have a civil and engineering degree from Princeton, as well as an MBA from Harvard. In setting the stage and at least defining these three areas, EHS is what I call the widely accepted, acknowledged activities, be it OSHA, be it EPA. Everyone agrees that we need these. People may disagree on, is there too much regulations, is there not enough? But this is what I call the core major element of sustainability of environmental activities for many years in the past, and still is very relevant. But more recently, the term net zero has evolved, and it really encompasses carbon and greenhouse gas emissions. Everyone's aware of these, or the importance of monitoring your greenhouse gas emissions, which include carbon. It's just that the phrase net zero has now taken on a life of its own, given much more interest in climate change. The way I encourage everyone to look at net zero or your gas emissions is to look at it from the perspective of what's going on internally, what can I do with my own operations to help mitigate or reduce actual gas emissions. That falls into what are called the category scope 1 and 2. Then I ask people to look at net zero from the standpoint of what's going on externally. And that's activities that you can influence through your supply chain, through carbon accounting, through purchase or sale of carbon offsets, et cetera, where again, you're not directly impacting these organizations because you don't control their operations, but hopefully you're having an indirect benefit in the environment. ESG, much more recently, has taken on a life of its own. As you see by the word environmental is in both EHS and ESG, but now it includes other aspects in terms of the social criteria and overall organizational governance. The issue with ESG, it's much more driven by reporting, by disclosure requirements and focus. You're basically calculating information, analyzing your data. And in this case, it's largely driven by stakeholders, your regulators, your government agencies, as well as customers, investors, insurance companies evaluating you from premium. So ESG is really almost a higher level view that encompasses net zero and EHS. So the question that people ask me, this is obviously very important. What does it mean to my organization? What should I do differently? So let me give you some of my perspective. The first is I think there are a couple of things that need to be understood at a baseline. Except EHS, OSHA, EPA, it's still there. I think it's also important to accept climate volatility, that it's changing. You only need to look at the dramatically reduced water levels in the Mississippi River and Lake Powell. There's tremendous volatility. And I think what's happened the last couple of years is we've gotten away from the disagreements, is it man-made or not? I think people just accept that in both their businesses as well as in government policies. And then you just have to take steps to address it. Sustainability is a key important subject that, again, encompasses all the above. You don't see the word sustainability directly in ESG, in net zero, and EHS. It's not in any of those acronyms, but it's a key common theme where everyone needs to know, what can I do to ensure the long-term viability of my organization? Is my supply chain reasonable? Are my operations sustainable? Can I continue operations given hurricanes and floods, et cetera? And I think the final point that I just want to emphasize as you as organizations are looking at what you should do is you have to acknowledge that there are limited resources even the bigger company has. That's a very key element because when you decide to do something, you may have to take away from other things. Now, the other key element before getting to specifics on each of these three key criteria is what should really drive your decision-making. And a lot of this is seemingly regulatory driven and stakeholder driven. My recommendation is what's most important is you have to accept government regulations and government incentives. That's the most important thing that you have to abide by, and that should drive your decisions, whether or not you necessarily agree with them. That's most important. There are secondary considerations when you look at investors, stakeholders that make demands upon you. You have to balance that against, does it really impact my long-term viability? And is this just creating information for the sake of information that won't really benefit the environment? And again, with limited resources to really make the most sense. So now let's get involved a little bit more details, and I'll give you some sense on what you might want to do when you're looking at net zero ESG. Again, we can have further discussions. My recommendations with regard to net zero dollar spending is, first and foremost, you always focus on the maximum you can do with your internal operations, which would largely include scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, to maximize your internal projects. You control them, you know it's going to benefit, and you get significant benefits from that in terms of saving money as well as ancillary peer benefits. There is obviously still a need to evaluate external net zero activities where you could buy carbon offsets, you could fund external activities. I just want to keep in mind that you want to be aware of what's actually happening. We've had people come to me and say, well, I've seen these great pictures on the website. They say that I should spend money and they're going to help reduce the deforestation, the Amazon, and I'll get all these benefits in exchange for my capital. The problem is, how do you know that's actually happening? And all of you need to be aware of what's the verification process. How do you know that the activities that you're funding actually happen? And there's this term called greenwashing, where you think you're doing well, but in reality, it's not happening. And you want to make sure when you're promoting all these net zero initiatives, you're very sensitive to that. ESG has probably gotten as much buzz as net zero. And the big thing I always like to stress to organizations is to look at the trade-offs involved with ESG. First of all, ESG is not monolithic. People look at it, especially from the financial community, well, what's your ESG rating? And they compare that to what's your profitability. The good thing about money and net income is that everyone agree upon it. I mean, how much did you make? It's pretty straightforward. The issue with ESG data is that there's no common set of criteria. Everyone's got their own methodology. The data differs. And you also have to be sensitive to, what about E versus S versus G? How do you weight different activities? How you evaluate them? There's a great deal of subjectivity. There's tremendous amounts of data. There's not any universally agreed upon standards or methodology. So you have to be very sensitive to this when you're looking at allocating resources and calculating ESG, and then based on your ESG parameters, taking actions. For instance, there are legitimate trade-offs because what may be a very socially redeemable activity may have other implications from an environmental standpoint, from a government standpoint. Again, going back to the whole notion of limited resources. We've had organizations say, and I'll use some of the analogy from COVID, that they are continuing to buy now masks from China because they had a balance. Yes, it would be better to buy the mask made in the United States, but they're significantly more expensive. They can't get reimbursement. The financial impact of buying masks locally, however, the benefit from an E or an S standpoint, are not nearly as important as the financial impact, because they want to maybe give employees bonuses. They want to make other investments in clean energy and more efficient HVAC equipment. And again, as long as you recognize that it's not a zero-sum game, that they're limited resources, you want to be aware of all these trade-offs. Now, I don't profess to have all the answers here. I just want everyone to be aware of the trade-offs involved, to look at these three major issues: EHS, net zero, ESG, understand that they are interrelated, sometimes in conflict. With net zero, again, focus what you can do internally to control and make your operations as efficient as possible. With regard to ESG, which has gotten lots of buzz of late, especially in the financial community, you have to be aware that there's not any one common data. People look at it differently. And again, if you're a publicly held company, every quarter people look at your earnings announcements. Realistically, they are not looking at your ESG report and what was your ESG figure this quarter versus the previous quarter. That's just the reality. I encourage everyone to contact me for more information. Maybe you want me to facilitate discussions in your organization to help you understand this. Glad to help. Please continue to follow Angelbeat on all these various platforms, and all the best. And thank you very much for your interest.